Today on Across the Fence, it may be the least understood creature in Vermont. We'll learn about the history, the habits, and the habitat of coyotes. Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. Eastern coyotes first appeared in Vermont in the late 1940s, according to the State Fish and Wildlife Department. Today, the coyote is well established in Vermont. And to find out more, we've called on an expert. Joining me is Kim Royer. Kim is a veteran wildlife biologist with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. She's been with us before, most recently to talk about bobcats in Vermont. Thanks for joining us again.
Oh, thank you, Judy. It's great to be here.
And so there's some confusion as to whether Vermont has coy dogs, coyotes, coy wolves. So what do we have?
It is confusing. What we have is an eastern coyote, and they came into the state, like you said, in the 1940s from west of the Mississippi. They traveled through Canada, bred with wolves, and actually moved into Vermont across the St. Lawrence River when it used to freeze. And I have an example of an eastern coyote skull right here. People, when they first moved in here, thought that they did breed with domestic dogs. They can breed with domestic dogs, but the offspring of those animals that have bred actually shift their reproductive cycle so that the young are born in the wintertime, and survival of those young is almost nil. So what we have now is really just an eastern coyote, an animal that has some wolf genes in it. So the skull is actually a little bit bigger than its western cousin, a little broader head, a little bigger teeth. And you can see the size difference between the eastern coyote. This happens to be a gray fox and a red fox. So when the coyotes moved in to Vermont, they actually caused a decline in the red fox population because of competition, moved them out of the territories that they were in. But for a better look at size, this right here is a gray wolf skull.
So if you're thinking you see a coyote but it looks big and you think, well, maybe it's a wolf, clearly there's a huge difference.
There's a huge difference. Now this is a Canis Lupus, which is a gray wolf. There's also a medium-sized wolf called an Eastern Canadian wolf, Canis Lupus, and that's somewhere between the two.
Okay.
But I can show you some pelts just so you get a size sense of the size.
Okay.
We'll move these out of the way. So here's a typical coyote, 30, 40 pounds average. They can get up to 50 pounds. This is, most Vermonters have seen an animal like this. This is a typical color gray, although they can come in blonde and go to a reddish phase. They have a buff chin, sort of a grizzled appearance, but this is the typical size that you have. Then if you want to compare that to the red fox, which again most Vermonters have seen, very red, but much smaller in size. The gray fox, again, even smaller than that, but similar coloration to the coyote. But here's the really interesting one.
Look at the size of this.
This is a gray wolf, a Canis Lupus. This was actually killed in Vermont.
Really?
92 pounds in northern Vermont. Huge, absolutely, almost looks twice the size of that coyote. And we actually had it genetically tested, and it was in fact a gray wolf, but the lab suggested that it probably had been bred in captivity because the ancestry was such that the parentage came from two different distinct population areas, and they didn't think that anything like that could have happened in the wild. Although we had done some carbon testing some isotope testing on the hair to see if it had eaten food from humans, and it doesn't seem like it had. So we think that this had been in the wild for a long time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things about coyotes that they're sort of best known for is their yapping howl. It's so unusual, and once you hear it, you never forget it. But it's really almost impossible to describe what it sounds like.
It is. It's a haunting sound, and I remember the first time I heard it in Vermont. I started in the 80s with the department, and it sort of can raise the hair on the back of your neck. Yeah. But it's the way that coyotes communicate with each other, and they tend to spend time in family groups, and they communicate through howling and the yipping. They also through scent marking, and they mark their territories through those noises. So they're really just kind of talking back and forth to each other.
And is there a particular habitat that coyotes prefer?
They are generalists in particular. I mean, they're an animal that can pretty much live anywhere.
They're very adaptable.
They're very adaptable, which is why they're so successful in Vermont. The wolf, which is less adaptable, was extirpated, but the coyote has been able to live with humans, and lives in New York City. It lives in downtown Chicago. In Vermont, it probably prefers areas like the Champlain Valley, where there's a mix of agriculture and forest, but it's found almost all throughout the whole state of Vermont.
Tell me a little bit about the coyote family groups and how big those families are in their territories.
So there's usually a pair, an alpha pair we call it, and then they can have an average of 6 pups, and that can change based on how much territory is available and how much prey is available, the food source. But an average of 6 pups. Those pups will stay with the family group through the fall, and if there's not a lot of territories available, some of them will even stay through the winter time. So that's the family group that you're hearing this time of year, is maybe 2 adults and maybe a couple of hangers-on.
And so we've been seeing some video of coyotes from a trail camera, and there's actually one that shows some pups. And so talk a little bit about when the mating happens, and that's usually when we hear a lot of coyote calls.
Right, and actually mating's starting right about now. We're starting to see animals mate. They have a gestation of about 60 days or 2 months, and then the pups are born around April. They'll hang around in the den for 6 to 8 weeks, and then they'll start to make some forays out into the field, a little distance from the den. And then the parents are going to start to train them how to eat and how to kill. And then in the fall, that's when you also hear a lot of communication, because the pups are learning how to hunt. And they're starting to split up from their parents, but they're still communicating.
Now, it's not easy being a coyote. Most studies show that 50% die in their first year. Why is that?
We're not really sure what all the mortality factors are for those young pups, but you can imagine when you're that small, there's starvation issues if there's not enough food available, there's disease issues, there's predation on those pups. The mortality on the older adults tends to be human mortality, human-caused mortality, trapping, hunting, and roadkill, cars.
Now, I understand coyote populations in Vermont can fluctuate depending on the year. So about how many do we have in the state?
Well, we estimate that we have an average of about 7,500, but that does fluctuate during the time of year and even from year to year, depending on food availability. So coyotes are really tied to how much prey species are out there, how many small mammals, how many snowshoe hare, how many deer. And so if there's a lot of food, there tends to be a higher density of animals. If there's not a lot of food, there's a lower density of animals.
What's the state's policy regarding hunting or trapping?
We actually have a regulated trapping season the 4th Saturday in October through the end of December, and there's a year-round hunting season, which is pretty typical of states across the country. About 39 states have a year-round hunting season, and there's a real benefit to that in that coyotes can become habituated pretty easily to people, and if they do, they can cause problems. They attack small pets sometimes. They can even come into people's yards and make them nervous around their children. Vermont's coyotes tend to be pretty wary of people, mostly because when they associate people with danger. And that's the way we want to keep them, is wild.
Like other predators, coyotes have a reputation as being a bad guy, but they do play an important role in our ecosystem.
Oh, they definitely do. They're so important to Vermont. They're actually playing part of the role that the wolf played before it went extinct. And so they actually control the numbers of foxes in the state, which actually has a benefit to waterfowl, to grouse, to small songbirds, because foxes tend to eat the eggs of those animals and the young of those animals. And so coyotes actually improve the diversity of small game and small birds, because they actually control some of the predators of those animals.
And there was even, we were talking ahead of time, there's even some evidence to suggest that even if the population were culled significantly through hunting, that would trigger them to reproduce more.
Yeah, it's so interesting. When coyotes are heavily hunted, their reproductive rate and survival of those pups goes up. So it is. I mean, so when you harvest heavily, and some people think they want to try to eliminate coyotes, which we don't endorse. I mean, we think the animal has a real valuable role in this state. But some people try to remove coyotes because they perceive that they're a problem with deer. but they're actually just stimulating reproduction and maybe survivability and maybe seeing an increase in the population over the long term.
Now, there seems to be agreement among wildlife biologists that coyotes are smart, but scientists also use words like cunning and secretive to describe coyotes. How would you describe them?
They are very wily, just like the Wile E. Coyote from the cartoon. They're very smart. I mean, they are a canid, and canids tend to be smart animals. And they perform a very important function in our natural system, and they're here to stay no matter what we do because they are so adaptable.
We touched on earlier a little bit about habitat, but talk a little bit more about diet. Like, what exactly do coyotes eat?
They eat about everything. They eat deer, they eat woodchucks, they eat snowshoe hare and other small mammals, but they'll also shift to things like apples and cherries and insects in times when those other types of prey species are not available. So, which is what makes them so adaptable, is they can shift food resources depending on what's out there on the landscape.
I even saw a coyote in my back pasture going after mice,
Yes.
which was interesting to watch, but then I thought, uh-oh, I need a bigger dog.
Yeah, right. Well, it's fun to watch them hunt because they kind of jump on the mice and scare them up, and they're very efficient.
Given that they prey to some degree on deer, do they affect the deer population? Can they affect the deer population?
Well, there's a lot of perception out there that they do. There's been a lot of studies in many states actually radio collaring fawns to see what the effect coyotes have on fawns. And they do kill fawns, there's no doubt about it, but actually we have found that bear and bobcat sometimes kill as many, if not more, fawns than coyotes do. So coyotes kind of get a bad rap.
Yeah.
Not that I'm trying to toss the rap to bear and bobcats, because they play an important role as well. But all of these animals are predators. That's what they do. And we factor that into our antlerless deer harvests, and we don't really believe that it has a long-term effect on the deer population.
In recent years, there's been an increase in bear sightings in Vermont, and there's always the yearly reminder to take your feeders down. Are there concerns that coyotes might be getting closer to humans and snacking at bird feeders or coming closer to human populations?
Well, it's one of our great concerns. Apart from trying to maintain a sustainable population of these species for future generations, we want to make sure that the public values these animals. And public tends not to value animals when they start to come closer to their houses, you know, beaver flooding their driveways, black bears on their back porch, or coyotes taking one of their little pets. And we understand that. So part of keeping these animals as part of the system is making sure that the public wants them there, and that's keeping them wild, which is what the form that hunting and trapping provide that function, keeping them wild.
Because it keeps them afraid of humans.
Afraid of humans, and that's really important.
Any myths about coyotes that you hear that are common?
Well, the common myth is the one you brought up, the fact that they're coy dogs and not coyotes. And we try to dispel that myth quite frequently. I think the other one is that the population's just going to keep expanding and expanding and expanding, and that is not the case. Coyotes are very territorial. They defend a home range of maybe 4 to 8 square miles.
Which I thought was really interesting because they won't let any other coyotes in there.
That's
in
right.
The area.
There's sometimes some transitional coyotes that are looking for a home range that might be around, but generally that family group is going to defend that home range. So there's only a certain number of home ranges in Vermont that can support coyotes, and so that's going to determine our population size. And
so the other population that grows beyond that is pushed to outer areas.
Exactly, which is why coyotes have spread so quickly into Maine, into Nova Scotia, down into New York, is because as they utilize home ranges in states like Vermont, the young animals that actually have to disperse go and find unoccupied home ranges in other places. And if there's some in Vermont, if they've been killed for some reason, they'll replace them here. But if there's not, they'll move other places.
And we're just about out of time, Kim. Any last words that you want to share with folks about coyotes?
Well, I think coyotes are a valuable animal to the system. They're here to stay, and I just hope that most of the public can appreciate them for the amazing animal that they are.
And once again, if you see pups, leave them alone. The best thing that can happen to them is that they stay afraid of people.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Judy. It's been great.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.